For number 10, they want us to find the critical numbers, and they want us to determine the absolute maximum and the absolute minimum. So the absolute maximum and the absolute minimum, these will occur at the critical numbers, or they could occur at the endpoints on the interval, so on 0 or on pi. Our first step is to take the derivative, and this is going to be a chain rule one. So y is going to be equal to u cubed, and u is going to be equal to cosine of x. So if we take the derivative of both of those, the derivative of u cubed is 3u squared, and I'm multiplying this by the derivative of cosine, which is negative sine of x. And then if I combine those, instead of the u, it's going to be cosine, so I'm going to kind of reorganize it and put negative 3 sine of x times cosine squared of x, and that'll be my derivative. So my next step is I need to set the derivative equal to 0. So negative 3 sine of x cosine squared of x is equal to 0. And my basic parts here are the negative 3, the sine, and the cosine squared. So the negative 3, that's never going to be equal to 0. Sine is 0 at, and you can either look at your unit circle, you can look at just a basic graph of sine. So if you went to your calculator and in the y equals typed sine of x, you could graph it and figure out where it crosses the axis. And this is going to happen at 0, at pi, and at 2 pi. And it's going to continue because it's periodic. Now, I'm actually not going to keep any of these. So I don't keep the 0 and the pi because those are already endpoints. So these are endpoints. So I don't need to worry about those. As for the 2 pi, that is outside of our interval, so I don't need to worry about that. So then, really, sine is not contributing any critical numbers. So let's look at the cosine squared. And when you look at the cosine squared, it's okay if you just look at cosine. So cosine is going to be 0 at, and again, you can look at the unit circle, you can look at the basic graph. If you just type it into the y equals and graph it, you're trying to figure out where it crosses the axis. You could use like zoom trig on the calculator. So this is going to happen at x is equal to pi over 2, as well as 3 pi over 2. Now here, I am going to keep pi over 2, but I'm not going to keep 3 pi over 2, only because that is outside of my given interval. So after all that, we basically only have one critical number, and that is pi over 2. So if I go over to my critical number, then this is going to be pi over 2, and I want to take that as well as the endpoints, so 0 and pi, and I want to plug all three of these into the original. And if you do that, you get 0, 1, and negative 1. So the absolute maximum, this is going to be 1, and it occurs at x is equal to 0. And the absolute minimum is negative 1, and this occurs at x is equal to pi. And this is kind of not that surprising because really with sines and cosines, normally the maximum is 1 and the minimum is -1 because it's a sine wave or a cosine wave. It goes between 1 and -1. So this is not that surprising that those are our maximum and minimum values.